obviously we have to look at terrestrial carbon cycle and marine carbon cycle, and we will split it into organic and inorganic, short term and long term, and see how they are related and what the combined carbon cycle looks like. Okay, that's what we want to get to eventually. So let's look at the short term terrestrial organic carbon cycle in a very simple sense. So the blue here, bluish color here, is the marine short-term organic carbon cycle. So we'll just focus on the atmosphere. You have atmospheric reservoir of 760 that we talked about. Again, numbers keep changing. There is photosynthesis, which is drawing down 60 petagrams carbon per year. Primary producers have a biomass of 600, a reservoir of 600 petagrams, and their depth is producing, let's say, 30 petagrams carbon, and the consumers, herbivores and so on, are taking up about 5. So you can imagine that despite being so many animals and humans, the reservoir size of carbon in the consumers is relatively small. This is going into the terrestrial soil and marine sediments, being washed by the rivers and so on, and the same from this side. This is going to decompose directly into the atmosphere, or there is going to be anaerobic kind of respiration or wetlands and so on, which emit methane. So there is indirect pipelines which also ultimately become atmospheric CO2, because methane is highly oxidizable, residence time of only 10 years. So eventually it also becomes carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, right? So there is a pathway through methane as well. Consumers respire and produce about 30 petagrams carbon per year. So death of the consumers adds a negligible amount. So here is the reservoir of 1600 petagrams carbon per year. Carbon, petagrams, not per year, right? So it's a reservoir, not a flux. Okay, so this is the short term. So photosynthesis, respiration, consumption, death, and so on are short term. They are few years, few days to a few years, right? The respiration and methanogenesis occur this way. CH2O, carbohydrates, consumes oxygen like we do. We breathe in oxygen, we burn the food we consume, and we produce carbon dioxide and water. Our breath has a lot of water in it, right? Plus we also sweat out water when it's hot. Methanogenesis happens when carbohydrate is directly being consumed by microbes which do not need oxygen. There are multiple steps there, fermentation involved, breaking down of the bonds, chemical bonds, to get their energy. So they produce carbon dioxide plus methane. Okay, so that's respiration and methanogenesis. We get to go back to the oxygen minimum zone. We looked at the oxygen profile before in terms of micromoles per kilogram here, going from the surface where it's high because there is photosynthesis which releases oxygen and there is exchange with the atmosphere. As we went below the surface, we had heterotrophs which are consuming all the organic matter and they were respiring CO2, so oxygen was going down, and it increased with depth. Why? Do you remember? I'll come back to it in a minute. Nitrate being consumed for photosynthesis near the surface increases because the dead and decaying matter is remineralized into nutrients, inorganic nutrients, so it increases, and then a steady state below. Total dissolved carbon, micromoles per kilogram, low near the surface because again photosynthesis is consuming it, increases corresponding to the respiration, and then it remains steady. Organic matter being produced near the surface mostly is eaten and recycled in the top 1 to 2 kilometers. barely 1% of it makes it to the bottom. So when we talk about limestone reservoir and sedimentary rock carbon reservoirs of 10 million and 40 million, it is these tiny amounts falling to the bottom over millions and hundreds of millions of years that are accumulating and producing that carbon reservoir. So the geologic timescales of converting that into rock, popping up with tectonic activities or coming up in volcanoes, that's the geologic timescale. So in the short time scale, this is just about the producers and consumers and changes. Why does oxygen increase again with depth? Remember, the bottom waters, deep waters, are coming from the surface at deep water formation sites, which are sinking from the surface, and they are bringing in high oxygen water to the bottom. So consumption is reducing it here, but accumulation of deep water oxygen coming from the surface increases carbon dioxide again. CO2, the pressure increases, temperature decreases, so CO2 is dissolved. It's like a Coke can sitting down here, right? And we said when upwelling happens, it's this high oxygen that's brought to the surface, increasing the PCO2 of the surface and creating outgassing. Marine organisms that are playing an active role in carbon cycle, as we will see, phytoplankton photosynthesizers like diatoms and coccolithophorids we talked about before, and zooplankton like foraminifera, forams as they're called, and radiolarians, so producers and consumers, play a role in carbon cycle because this is calcium carbonate, which is obviously part of the carbon cycle. The biological pump, revisiting it again, we have photosynthesis and production of carbohydrate. Organic matter is settling down and being respired in the oxygen minimum zone and all the way to the bottom. Remember the dead whale falling down and being eaten by all kinds of snaky looking things and worms and so on. So decomposition of decomposition of carbohydrates, nutrient release or remineralization, oxygen consumption, and upwelling of nutrients. So this is what we called the biological pump. Okay, there is a direct solubility pump as well, which is related to upwelling of the inorganic carbon up into the euphoric zone for photosynthesis. So that's the short-term terrestrial and marine carbon cycle. We'll look at the details as we go along.